The next item of business is debate on motion 21263 in the name of John Swinney on the OECD review of curriculum for excellence. I would ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on John Swinney to speak to and move the motion. For up to 15 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I welcome the opportunity to debate the approach to the review of curriculum for excellence that has been commissioned from the OECD and to provide the opportunity for members to set out on the record in a debate where the OECD can reflect on the comments and the points made by members on the issues that are relevant to the conduct of this review. Before I go on to talk in detail about that, although we've touched on some education issues in the statement on COVID-19, and I think we may be returning to this question tomorrow from what I've heard, perhaps I've been misinformed today, but I wanted to set out some of the further issues that are relevant to the educational perspectives on COVID-19. First of all, on guidance, we recognise the importance of ensuring that schools, early learning and childcare settings and further higher education institutions have clear guidance to help them deal with the impacts of COVID-19 on their learners and their staff. That advice has been available from Health Protection Scotland, and it will be updated on a consistent basis to ensure that the events of yesterday are fully reflected in the advice that is made available in every given circumstance to support the delivery of education in our communities. Obviously, as I indicated in my response to Mr Green and also to Mr Crawford a few moments ago, the whole question of school closures is a very active question of discussion and consideration, and we are involved in those discussions are taking place today, and I will engage with them later on this afternoon. To inform that decision-making, we are of course undertaking, it's my second point in this respect, monitoring on the situation on the ground with active participation from COSLA, from the Association of Directors of Education and from local authorities around the country. And of course, local authorities are having to make a number of practical decisions in relation to pupil and staff absences and in relation to questions where the school estate has to be cleaned in the where an identified case of coronavirus has been detected. And then thirdly, there is the question of resilience and business continuity, and we are working very closely with our local authority partners through the Scottish Resilience Partnership to ensure that we have in place all contingency measures to deal with all aspects of coronavirus and the potential impacts of localised school closures. We fortunately were able to reach agreement about variations to the Scottish Negotiation Committee for Teachers arrangements for the employment of teachers to ensure that we have adequate flexibility to deal with what will be a changing position at local level. Local authorities have also been asked to consider how best to manage the impact of any localised school closures on key workers and low-income families, including in respect of free school meals, which is a very significant issue for many of the young people within our society, where school will represent a place where they will be able to rely upon high-quality nutrition being available to them. And these are some of the very practical issues that, with which we wrestle. As I indicated in my response to Mr Simpson a moment ago, the National Qualifications timetable and exam diet remains on track, although I have asked the Scottish Qualifications Authority for contingency arrangements to be considered, and a qualifications contingency planning group now exists to draw together the government, the SQA, our related stakeholders, and that National Qualifications contingency planning group met today and will be providing me with further advice in that respect. Now, as I say, I'm very happy to keep members updated about all aspects of COVID-19, and I don't for a moment suggest that what I've just placed on the record will not need to be updated in short order, but I hope members will appreciate that we are dealing with a fast-moving and challenging situation. To turn now, Presiding Officer, to the matter of the OECD review, I obviously listened very carefully to the conclusions of the Education and Skills Committee inquiry in this respect, and also the parliamentary decision requesting that we take forward a review of both the broad general education and also the senior phase. I've taken into account the representations made by members of opposition parties and also the output of the committee deliberations in coming to the conclusion of commissioning the review, and this debate is an opportunity for members, having had sight of the remit of the review, which was published on the 26th of February, to place on the record issues that they believe the OECD inquiry should consider. And of course, obviously, the coronavirus effect will obviously have an impact on the timetable for the review that will be undertaken. I hope as we embark on this discussion, in which I hope will be a positive and a constructive debate, we can focus on what I think is the central question, is what do we want Curriculum for Excellence to achieve over the next 10 years for young people within Scotland. And to ensure that that debate can be as broad and as inclusive as possible, we must ensure that everybody who has a contribution to make to that discussion is able to make that contribution. I'm particularly keen to make sure that the teaching profession has the opportunity to make that contribution based on their experience, without any of the confines or the constraints of their relationship of employment to their local authorities. If teachers have something to say about their experience about, well, I hope they do have something to say, because teachers will have the lived experience of delivering Curriculum for Excellence, and I want to make sure Curriculum for Excellence represents the aspirations and the hopes and the driving direction of our teaching profession, because fundamentally our education system will be enhanced if we hear a strong voice from the teaching profession in this review. I think it's important as we embark on this exercise that we reflect on the foundations of Curriculum for Excellence. Scotland's curriculum emerged from a national debate about education which took place, started about 20 years ago. It engaged the Education Committee in Parliament, it engaged many stakeholders. And fundamentally, the curriculum was designed to be anchored in values which are engraved on the mace that sits in front of the presiding officer's chair today, values that we aspired to as a country, that we wanted to ensure that wisdom, compassion, justice and integrity, the four values engraved on the parliamentary mace, were reflected in every single one of our schools around the country. And I think there's a really powerful sentiment in that the values epitomised by it, the symbol of our democracy, is reflected in every one of our schools around the country. Secondly, Scotland's curriculum was designed to ensure that we created young people who had command of the four capacities, that they were confident individuals, they were responsible citizens, they were successful learners, they were effective contributors. Although we don't have an empirical measure for these four capacities, I see these four capacities increasingly in the young people of Scotland. And I see particularly the concept of confident individuals much more readily than I see that in the generation of which I was a part. And I think the aspiration of Curriculum for Excellence to ensure that young people acquire those capacities and then can go on to deploy those capacities is an essential element of the purpose of our curriculum. And then thirdly, in the updated narrative on the curriculum which was published last September, we reaffirmed that our determination was that Scotland's curriculum helped our children and young people gain the knowledge, skills and attributes needed for life in the 21st century. And that, to me, encapsulates the sense of hope and the sense of purpose that should lie at the very heart of our curriculum, of making sure that every young person, whichever pathway they decide to choose as a consequence of their school education, has been equipped with the knowledge, skills and attributes needed for life in the 21st century, which we all recognise to be a changing environment, and an environment that will place many demands on young people to be able to adapt and to change to the circumstances that will prevail. So in looking at and I hope that, and I sense as I discuss with stakeholders, as I listen to parliamentary debates, that fundamental core of Curriculum for Excellence still commands very broad political support. And I hope as we consider some of the tactical and operational aspects of the review of the curriculum, that we can actually have a positive discussion about how the aspirations of Curriculum for Excellence can be most effectively deployed for young people around the country. So the remit of the review is designed to give those opportunities to the OECD to consider these questions and to do so across a number of themes. And the themes that we've identified in the review are around curriculum design, considering how the curriculum is being designed locally and used flexibly to meet the needs of all learners, and how well the curriculum design principles are being used to support learning and achievement, including collaboration with colleges and other partners. This approach will allow the OECD to explore the concerns about numbers of subjects that have been raised by this Parliament, but as part of a broader look at how the curriculum is being used to meet the needs of all learners. There will, however, be an important debate to be had around about that on the question, this is the second question in the review, around the debate between local flexibility against increased prescription. And that discussion is never going to be an absolute discussion, although if we decide as a system that there is an argument for more prescription than there is currently within the system, then let's have that open discussion about what is involved. But for my part, I would place on record my belief that the young people of Scotland will be better served by greater flexibility being available to meet local needs, as envisaged by Curriculum for Excellence, so that educators can listen carefully to the aspirations of young people and to put in place the educational approaches that will enable them to be successful. I accept that there is an argument to be had, a debate to be had about that, as to whether there should be more prescription or more flexibility. But I am very keen to make sure that we have an open discussion about this question, and that the advantages, which I believe are very evident about local flexibility, are very clearly understood as part of this review. The third area is about the depth and the breadth of the learning in the senior phase, and this, I suppose, relates very directly to the balance between the broad general education and the transition to the senior phase. Again, what was envisaged in Curriculum for Excellence was a 3-year broad general education and secondary education, which then created the platform for greater specialisation in the senior phase. But I listen carefully to the thoughts and the points that are put forward, and I recognise the transition from the broad general education to the senior phase. It's a really significant issue to be addressed, and it was a theme that came through the Education Skills Committee review very carefully. Of course.
Liz Smith.
Secretary, listening to what he's saying on this issue, does he agree that within the OEC's remit, the issue about flexibility will be a point of debate within both the broad general education and the senior phase? Because I think there are issues about where that flexibility is perhaps more important, and whether the debate about whether we should have a little bit more in terms of statutory recommendations would happen in the senior phase.
John Swinney.
I think the question of flexibility runs through the entire secondary education, because I am listening carefully to educators who are saying to me that they are increasingly configuring their education approaches to meet the aspirations of learners. And that, to me, is the demonstration of flexibility. I readily understand there's a different debate, there's an alternative point of view, which says there should be a prescribed amount of learning that a young person, every single young person, should be doing. And I suppose the boundaries of my definition of that prescription is around literacy and numeracy and health and well-being. I accept that others will think it should stretch further than that. And these are some of the issues that we have to tease out quite genuinely, because I simply express my view here. It's a view informed by a lot of dialogue and discussion around the system, but I appreciate there are people that take a different view, and I know that Liz Smith has a long track record of having a view of the need for, I think I set it out correctly, of a greater degree of prescription, but that's what we'll have discussed as part of the review. I think also, Presiding Officer, we have to make sure that we are meeting the needs of all learners, and the Government is going to commission some work on data collection from Scottish schools on the number of subjects offered in the senior phase, with a view to understanding any correlation with social deprivation, and that will enable us to understand whether there's any pattern emerging which is an inadvertent pattern that in any way sees young people in areas of deprivation having less educational opportunity. I happen to take the view that they have much more opportunity, that is creating good pathways, but we will do the work to assess that issue. And that also relates very directly to the whole notion of whether everything in our education system needs to be judged by national qualifications, or whether vocational and other awards should be considered as part of the outcomes that have been achieved by young people, which I certainly recognise to be very significant advantages and attributes for young people in our education system. And I know that the Green Party submitted an amendment today which wasn't selected, which related to questions of homework, and I certainly confirm that there is every opportunity for the review to look at these particular questions. Presiding Officer, I stand here as an Education Secretary, confident in Scotland's curriculum, confident that the right judgments were made 20 years ago, that we were designing an approach that would enable young people to gain the knowledge, skills and attributes needed for life in the 21st century. But I'm not standing here as an Education Secretary saying everything is perfect and that there's nothing that needs to be done to improve the situation. And I hope, as part of the review, we can have an open, constructive discussion about how that best can be advanced, and the Government will listen very carefully to the views of members today. I'm sure those undertaking the review will do likewise, and we can have a broad, engaged discussion about how we can make Scotland's curriculum work for every one of the children and young people in Scotland today.
Cabinet Secretary, I can't remember if you moved the motion
And I move the motion in my name.
So we'll be doubly sure. Thank you very much. I now call Jamie Green for up to 11 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The motion is duly moved and it will be duly supported. I'll say that from the outset. Presiding Officer, we find ourselves debating education in extremely unusual circumstances and against the backdrop of what I think are undoubtedly very difficult times for the industry, for teachers, parents and pupils themselves. I also know these are personally very difficult times for many of us, even those of us in the Chamber, and even including the Deputy First Minister himself, who these benches would like to pass our very best thoughts in regards to him personally. But let's also be clear, when it comes to having a frank and honest debate about curriculum for excellence, we're having this debate today because of sustained pressure from these benches and from many others in the Chamber. And whether it's been P1 testing, international rankings, these benches and from many others in the Chamber. And whether it's been P1 testing, international rankings, the attainment gap, subject choice, the exam diet, prescription to account, and has used its opposition time to bring such matters to the fore and to the eyes of the public, and rightfully so, in my view. This debate is very welcome, but it's also very overdue, Cabinet Secretary. Now, I will approach this constructively, as I'm sure all members with an interest in this will, but there may be areas where we do disagree, even as comfortable as that feels in the current climate. On several occasions, this Parliament has expressed some discomfort at the direction of travel of the Curriculum for Excellence, and the OECD review that we're talking about today is only one step in restoring full and every faith and confidence in that curriculum. And that is the key, because for me, restoring faith is what should be at the heart of all of this. Faith of the teachers, of the parents, and those sitting in the classrooms. Because sometimes the perception is as important as the statistics and the figures that we so often band around as politicians. Outcomes are important, but also so are the anecdotes of those to whom this matters so much. And neither should this review be seen as a standalone solution to any perceived weaknesses in the system. It should not be an opportunity to kick issues into the long grass or hide behind the protected cloak of an independent review and the timetable that comes with, albeit extended perhaps now. I'm clear that if there are issues that can be addressed now, then there's a duty on us and the Education Secretary to do just that. Fundamentally, one has to ask, why are we having a review at all? And I think there are triggers that have led to where we are. We've had debates in the Parliament on this. The Education Skills Committee has done a lot of work on this, and be it the attainment gap, be it subject choice, be it declining results in certain hires, these to me are not blips or variants. These are trends, no matter how you look at them, and that's why they must be looked at. That's why we must be analysing the gap in outcomes between the richest and the poorest of society. They must be looked at. It's why we should be looking at why schools are turning to multi-level teaching, despite its widespread disapproval from the industry itself. These are questions that we must get to the bottom of. And why is this important? Well, a teacher I met at an event last week, probably one of the last such events we'll have for a while, over a glass of wine, said to me that he had a class of 30 students, no teaching assistants, and felt like he was trying to teach more with less. He had a number of teachers with very difficult additional support needs, which took up a lot of his time, and an ever-expanding list of non-core subjects to pack into an already packed curriculum. He quoted and gave me permission to use this quote. He said, "If I'm being asked to teach things outside of my subject competence and remit, how can I guarantee parents that I'm also teaching the basics?" And for me, that is why this debate is so important, is we must get those basics right too. And that's why the review needs to have an inclusive approach, because I want to hear from teachers and those in the industry. What do they think? What are their lived experiences of what has changed? And has it changed for the better or not, if the case may be? Now, earlier when we talked about having a review of this nature, the Cabinet Secretary said that a review of the broad general education at this stage in implementing the previous review is not necessarily a priority. So my question is, what has changed in that period of time? Why now is a general review of broad general education possible if we are still implementing previous recommendations of a previous review of it? The OECD warnings on this go as far back as 2015. They said, and I will quote from that report, "Judgments must be informed by trustworthy evidence of student progress and learning. It is important to have a coherent and carefully designed framework in order to maximise the quality of the information and minimise consequences such as reducing rather than promoting teachers' assessment capabilities." It is therefore right, I think, that the OECD have their place in this discussion, but that should not be against the backdrop of stopping any good work that was already going on before the review was announced. I'm happy to give way.
John Swinney.
I'm grateful to Mr Green for giving me that. My views on the record, I would not have been having a review for the broad general education at this stage because we are implementing the 2015 conclusions, but I've respected the view of Parliament, so I'm enabling it to happen. One of the reasons why I didn't think it was an appropriate timing is that many of the reforms that we have introduced, particularly on assessment and moderation and benchmarking, all of which were called for by the OECD, have not found all of their effects within our education system. So, but we're having the review now, but I simply put it on the record for completeness as to where it's all come from.
Jamie Green.
And I thank the Cabinet Secretary for clarifying that. And I know there was disagreement at the time. I actually believe I sat in that debate when it was had, and I heard those arguments then. But I think as the Parliament decided collectively that these are issues that are important because they are all interlinked, and I'm going to come on to why a broad approach is necessary. I think when Curriculum for Excellence was originally suggested, it absolutely enjoyed cross-party support, as is recognised. And I think the major reason for this is the way that it was sold to us, to parents, and to the teaching profession themselves, because its focus of mapping a child's learning journey from nursery right through to the end of secondary seemed sensible, and to an extent it still does, to look at learning holistically and not solely through the eyes of the prism of results-based only. It does have a place. But if those results paint a picture of change or trends, then those are warning signs, Cabinet Secretary. Some things are more easily measurable than others, but some things must be measured. Now, I was surprised, as we've discussed, that the original proposals only sought to review the senior phase, but Parliament decided otherwise. Now, during that debate, I remember these benches argued vociferously for the expansion of the remit, and it was resisted for the reasons mentioned. But I think because we are seeing weaknesses in some areas of the senior phase, the problems of this can be found much rooted earlier in the curricular cycle, which is why BG inclusion is a must. And I agree with the Cabinet Secretary. I think to ensure that we have a workforce of the future, we need graduates with the right STEM skills, the vital roles that we need for a modern economy, and whatever economy that is tomorrow. Tomorrow seems so far away sometimes these days. And I welcome some of the debates we've had on that. The funding is welcome. But I'm sure that unless we get the basics right and engaging people with numeracy, with science, with literacy, with technology at a very early age, and crucially during that BG phase, we won't be able to provide the workforce that we need for the 21st century. Now, for many learners, for me, and this is vitally important, S3 is that vital transition into parts of the senior phase, and the culmination of the academic journey to that point in BGE. These are formative years, in my view, but they are formative years where core skills must be attained, where students can assess their options, and at that point they're making key decisions about subject choices that will play a vital role in their future careers, especially when choosing their options for further higher education or apprenticeships. We cannot isolate the perceived decline in results at higher levels as just a senior phase issue. And that is why that it is right that the entire CFE is broadly reviewed. I want to be clear from the outset that the Scottish Conservatives support the principles of the Curriculum for Excellence, but our concerns, however, lie with its delivery and some of the outcomes that we have seen. We only need to look at the evidence to understand that there may be systemic problems, the availability of subject choice reducing. We know that because Reform Scotland told us last year that the majority of Scottish schools were offering just 6 subjects at S4, far from the 8 or even 9 perhaps that we enjoyed when we were at school. Many classrooms are indeed increasing in size. We know that because that's what teachers are telling us, and that is perhaps why with teacher shortages we have increased multi-level teaching, which has a detrimental effect on the learning environment. We know that. We know that higher pass rates have dropped for a number of years in a number of subjects, including, crucially, history, English, psychology. We know these figures to be true. We know that latest international PISA rankings found maths and science levels had dropped to record lows. We know that in some areas there is a widening attainment gap. We know this because the Parliament's Education and Skills Committee has consistently raised concerns. It raised concerns about the governance structures and clarity within Education Scotland and its impact on the curriculum. We know that the OECD acknowledged this when it set out its remit. There's always been broad backing for the curriculum, but it's clear to everyone, both in this chamber and outside in the wider education sector, that despite the hard work of teachers and educators right across Scotland, we don't have a system that fully delivers what it says on the tin. It's easy to dismiss these things as cyclical, but there's an incumbency on all of us, every member in the chamber, that any weaknesses in our system will be felt for generations to come, and that is why it is so important we get it right. In conclusion, I would like to clarify what we want to see. Well, first of all, Cabinet Secretary, there should not really be a need for a review of this nature, but we did ask for one, and we asked for its remit to be as comprehensive as it can be, and so it shall be, and so it is welcome. And these benches will support the government, especially in the current climate, in delivering the curriculum for excellence and improving outcomes for Scotland's young people. We will do that where we can. We want this to succeed. And I hope that the tone of my comments, if nothing else, illustrates that. But the ministers must realise that it cannot be business as usual in the meantime. My predecessor, Liz Smith, waited some years for a government debate like this. Let me tell you, patience will not be so forthcoming in the future.
Now call Ian Gray for 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It is indeed now almost 2.5 years since the Government chose to lead a debate on schools in this chamber, so to say it's welcome is a bit of an understatement. What's not welcome, of course, is the context in which it happens. It happens in circumstances that none of us could have foreseen even a few weeks ago, never mind 2 years ago. The immediate questions about our schools loom large, and they are for how long we can or should keep our schools open at all. So, as the Deputy First Minister rightly did, we should take a moment to understand just what a difficult decision this is, and to accept and acknowledge that the Government is following the expert advice, which at the moment is that schools should largely remain open. We should take the chance to thank teachers and other staff who are doing that, keeping the schools open, while trying to manage the entirely understandable concerns or even fears of parents, children and indeed their own colleagues. I just mentioned in passing that I see that the EIS have written to the Deputy First Minister asking if he will, for the sake of transparency, publish the scientific advice on which these decisions have been based, and I hope that might be something that he will be able to consider. So in spite of the overwhelming urgency, though, of that pandemic impact, this afternoon's topic is still a very relevant one, because it is about the medium to long-term future of secondary school education, not really the most immediate challenges. And Scottish education is a bit of a story. It's got a narrative spanning many decades, and the review, as outlined in the government motion, is a significant one, a milestone in that narrative. Since the revolution of comprehensive education over 50 years ago, changes to our schools, pedagogy and qualifications have tended to be evolutionary, and the most effective changes build on the best of what we had rather than tearing it all up. That was true of 5 to 14, of awards for all, and indeed of curriculum for excellence, which of course has its own story, as the Cabinet Secretary said. It began and grew from a very genuine and wide national conversation in which all sectors of Scottish society participated. And I think that is, as he spoke about, exactly why its core values and principles were, as he often reminds us, accepted across the political spectrum, and why they still are. And I say gently to Jamie Green that actually it's a lot more than about how the principles of curriculum for excellence were sold. I think it actually is those principles themselves which were accepted, and I hope still are, across the political spectrum. But the implementation of CFE has proven difficult, and we now see some serious consequences, some unforeseen and some perhaps unwise. Firstly, that implementation happened in another time of crisis following the financial crash. Budgets were squeezed, teacher numbers fell, class sizes increased, and we can argue about whose fault that was or to what degree, which government's fault it was. But the fact is, it was, I think, the worst possible context for curricular change. There were also elements of CFE which, on looking back, seem to have emerged very late on and not really from the consensus. Most importantly, the 3+3 structure, 3 years of broad general education. And then finally, we also had, following or during the implementation of CFE, changes to the exam structure, which, as Larry Flanagan of the EIS told the committee, were never really a necessary consequence of CFE, and which seem to have proved a poor and difficult fit with it. So the review has to be broad enough to examine all of these, and it must also engage parents, teachers, educationalists and politicians to ensure its findings carry the same broad support as those founding principles of CFE do. And the review has its own story and narrative too. In this, Jamie Green was quite right, because the government long denied the need for the review at all. They then conceded an examination of the senior phase. It took significant pressure from Parliament to see that an extension to cover S1 to 3 and the transition from broad general education to senior phase. And it took even more pressure to ensure that it will cover qualifications and attainment too. But we've arrived today at the review remit and a government motion which does commit to all of this and to very broad engagement. So it might have been a sometimes uncomfortable process, but we have arrived at the right place. which is why we certainly haven't sought to amend what is, to my mind, a perfectly commendable government motion, which we will support this evening. It is, of course, critical that, having accepted the need for the review, and not necessarily, as he said himself, of his own volition, and having conceded the breadth of the review, the Education Secretary now makes a virtue of it and does everything to ensure that there is a deep consideration of where we are. And much of what he said in his opening remarks, I think, was quite positive in that sense. Now, in a whole different context, of course, there's a debate about what constitutes a generation. Well, in Scottish education, 15 years pretty much is a curricular generation, you know. CFE, as lots of us think of it as new, but it's really been there as long as many curricular changes. 5 to 14, I'm not sure, lasted as long as 15 years for all the impact it has made. So there is an argument that there's a need for a review just by dint of time, but I think actually the need was signalled, as Jamie Green alluded to, by a series of warnings, kind of canaries in the coal mine, as it were. And the measure of its effectiveness will be the degree to which it examines these and recommends how we should respond. So those were, firstly, the narrowing of the curriculum, with senior phase pupils being able to choose fewer subjects to study to SQA exam level. A further consequence of that has been the impact on specific subjects, such as modern languages, where participation has dropped. Related to that is the 3+3 model, which has squeezed curricular choice on entering the senior phase at least. And there is little evidence, I think, that the idea that the 3-year senior phase would allow for more exams to be attempted over several years has really worked. Then there is what teachers themselves described to the committee as systematic and routine teaching of pupils at 2, 3, or even 4 different exam levels, all in the same class. National and higher exams are in no way designed to be taught like this. It's true that in the past, standard grades, for example, were produced in order to be delivered in this way. But that is not true of our current exam system. And the committee could find no evidence whatsoever that multi-level teaching, as it's become called, was happening for any educational reason whatsoever. None of the witnesses could give an educational reason for pursuing this method. All the evidence was that it was driven by teacher shortages, curricular structure, and actually the convenience of senior management in some cases, because it made it easier to timetable subjects. So none of these things flow necessarily from those principles of curriculum for excellence, but they do all risk compromising or even undermining those principles. So it's critical that the review addresses them, does so fully and frankly, and that we then respond to ensure that the next chapter we write in the story of Scottish education is the tale of success, which I sincerely believe we all want to see.
Paul Ross-Greer for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To say it feels surreal to be standing here having this debate would be an understatement. The business of Parliament is about to change quite radically and for a number of months. But for now, we're here, and the review whose remit will agree today will have consequences for our schools and for our young people for many years to come. Despite the circumstances, I'm grateful to finally have the opportunity to discuss education on a government motion. It's been a while. And relying on opposition time to debate the government's defining mission just hasn't been good enough. It was June of 2018 when the government announced that its proposed education governance bill would not be going ahead. That feels like a long time ago now. Shelving it may not have been what the government wanted, but that decision was certainly welcomed by teachers and their unions, by parents, education experts, and by opposition parties. The government was told that governance reform is not what's needed. Instead, it was workload and bureaucracy that teachers highlighted as creating barriers to learning. Before turning to the education system itself, though, I want to make a wider point about the attainment gap between pupils from the most and least privileged backgrounds. This gap might manifest itself in the classroom and in course results, but it doesn't begin there. Poverty is not created in schools, and an attainment gap rooted in poverty and inequality will not be closed only through measures that we take within the education system. As child poverty once again increases because of decisions knowingly taken by the UK government, we should be clear that this is not naturally occurring or inevitable. The UK is the 5th richest nation on the planet, Nothing is inevitable about 1 in 4 children here living in poverty. Nor is it inevitable that poverty is more highly concentrated among single-parent families, communities of colour, and households where someone has a disability. Cuts to welfare support and a regime of sanctions designed to punish rather than help people on low incomes make life so much harder. And their impact on children and young people leads straight to the classroom. Pupils struggle to learn when they're hungry, when they can't afford to go on the same school trips as their peers, when they get excluded for their uniforms not being up to standard. Good work is being done to tackle and to mitigate against this in schools, including the expansion of free school meals, such as what's just been announced in Western Bartonshire, and income maximisation projects. But, and this is one of the key lessons that I took from the Education Committee's visit to Finland, if we're to really achieve excellence and equity in our education system, it must exist in a society which is far more equitable in the first place than ours currently is. Otherwise, instead of reducing teachers' workload to improve the quality of teaching and learning, yet more responsibility will be heaped on overworked staff to solve problems that are simply out with their control. But turning back to the education system itself, as the recent Education Committee inquiry took evidence on, there does appear to be issues of both subject choice and subject availability, which correlate with the level of deprivation in a school community. Put simply, it looks like senior phase pupils in deprived communities, for example, will simply have fewer hires to choose between than their counterparts in our least deprived communities. And I take the Deputy First Minister's point about a wider range of subjects and qualification opportunities overall, but looking specifically at hires, that's what the limited data seems to show us. And the number of subjects an S4 pupil can take, as colleagues have already mentioned, in one sitting seems to correlate again against deprivation. Before coming to any judgment about the strengths and weaknesses of the system, we first need to confirm exactly what is happening, which is why I was glad to come to an agreement with the Education Secretary, whereby the government's committed to conduct a data collection and review exercise in tandem with the OECD review, looking at the issue of senior phase subject availability and its relationship with social deprivation. The data that we've been working from until now has been blunt and imperfect, largely the result of freedom of information trawling by journalists. A quality-assured collection exercise conducted by the government will be very useful, though of course it must only be the start of this piece of work. What we do with that data, particularly if an inequity is identified, is what matters. The impact of community deprivation is felt in other areas of provision as well, of course. The committee's recent STEM inquiry received evidence of schools in deprived communities struggling to access science fairs or get STEM role models to give demonstrations, for example. To take something out beyond deprivation, though, but very relevant to the remit of this review and this debate, there are issues with the design of the National 5 qualification which need looked at. As I've raised during previous opposition debates, the requirement of 160 hours for Nat 5s isn't compatible with the number of hours available in the year. By the standard definition of 160 teaching hours in a year, it's simply impossible to timetable. And given that, there's a lack of clarity as to what 160 hours actually means here. Is it purely teaching hours? Or does it include an expectation of a number of hours of independent revision or homework? Does the 160 hours start in third year? And would that not call into question the change away from the 2+2+2 model to the 3 and 3-year senior phase that Ian Gray mentioned? There are also issues with the way in which teachers are moderated under Curriculum for Excellence. CFE was meant to empower teachers to be responsive to the needs of their pupils, to have the freedom to teach and not be locked into prescriptive requirements. Instead, there's evidence that teachers have been closely monitored through CFE experiences and outcomes and benchmarks, standardised assessments, self-evaluation and inspection indicators. All of these combine to create a substantial bureaucracy. We need to consider how both workload and teacher moderation impacts on learning under Curriculum for Excellence and whether the principles and aims of CFE are still being met. Part of that workload issue is the role of homework. There's now a significant amount of evidence which suggests that a lot of homework is not beneficial to learning. Now, this is particularly the case at primary level, but evidence does point to a similar problem in secondary level where when the volume of homework is high and when the quality is low. When it's handed out almost as a ritual, particularly due to the expectation of some parents and carers and teachers that because they had to do it, so must their children. And when it's handed out not as reinforcement, but to cover areas of learning for which there is not enough timetable class time, it's acting as a sticking plaster for structural problems, such as what I've just mentioned with National 5s. Most important of all for this review, though, teachers must be able to speak freely and openly about the issues that they face. Their input cannot be mediated or filtered through their employers. They must not fear repercussions or identifying the issues that they face in their particular roles. Only then can this review really identify the problems in Scottish education. So I'm grateful to have received the Cabinet Secretary's reassurances in this regard. And as such, the Scottish Greens are content to approve the remit of this review. We look forward to working with the Government and with colleagues across Parliament to consider its outputs and what improvements we're to make as a result. Thank you.
I call Beatrice Wishart, also for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate is very welcome. As others have noted, the debate on education in the Government's own time is long overdue. There is much to be proud of in Scottish education, but it's been clear for some time that parts of the system are struggling. As the coming weeks present unparalleled challenges to our society as a whole, teachers will no doubt go above and beyond, once again, the call of duty. And in many ways, that's a habit that they are already very much accustomed to, because teacher workloads have already been stretched for a long time. There's been a failure to provide the structure, time and support that they need in order to do their jobs and thrive. Concerns about the trajectory of the system are no reflection on the work and efforts of teachers and pupils and parents. But Scotland's recent feedback from international rankings has thrown the situation into sharp focus. The PISA results made clear what many teachers have long suspected, that something is going wrong in Scottish education, and that is why my party voted for this review. This provides an opportunity to take a step back and properly reflect on what can be done to reverse those downward trajectories. The original inspiration for this review was the Education Committee's investigation into the narrowing of subject choices. I'm deeply concerned about the evidence that suggests this may have a particular impact on rural areas. Since then, there have been more reports showing a divergence between what is happening in urban Scotland compared to rural Scotland. Indeed, Scottish Liberal Democrats research found that in some places, students were making round trips of up to 40 miles for subjects as basic as physics. But beyond narrowing subject choices, there's plenty more that could be of interest to the OECD. There's been continuing confusion about the responsibilities of Education Scotland. Abolishing the survey of literacy and numeracy when the results declined to replace it with a new national testing has made it harder to see what's really going on. And then there's the standardised assessments, where the OECD's own recommendations may have been misinterpreted. As a result, thousands of P1s are about to take these tests again, whether or not they're compatible with play-based learning for a purpose that isn't quite clear. Or there's the decimation of our additional support needs and support staff workforce. In the last 10 years, the number of additional support needs teachers has been reduced, while the number of pupils requiring ASN support has increased markedly. Now 31% are identified as having additional support need. There is growing evidence of a workforce that is straining under immense pressure. A survey commissioned by the EIS found 6 out of 10 full-time teachers work more than 8 hours extra above their contractual working hours each week. Another found that 76% of respondents reported that they feel stressed frequently or all of the time within their jobs. There are many things that concern those of us on the opposition benches, but, Presiding Officer, I accept that this review will not be a silver bullet for Scottish education. There is a limit to what we can practically consider. That was the case even without the inevitable complications that the next few months will bring as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But there is a need to reflect on the fundamental designs of the curriculum. The breadth of concern demonstrates the need for a reliable system of accountability and reflection. There needs to be a continuous evaluation in Scotland, a circle of constructive feedback, and I emphasise the word constructive, that strengthens our learning system for our young people. At the moment, that doesn't seem possible because of a fundamental conflict of interest within Education Scotland. As they set policy and carry out inspections, they are tasked with marking their own homework. As evidence of deterioration accumulates, that has to be called into question. In my letter to the Cabinet Secretary, I asked whether representatives from the OECD would be allowed to directly engage with opposition spokespeople, but more importantly, those on the front line must be allowed to have their voices heard. Teachers need to be heard and need to be seen to be heard. direct, unfiltered evidence from practitioners needs to be given a platform. This review presents an opportunity for that. The full breadth of Curriculum for Excellence experiences and concerns must be heard. Thank you.
We now move to the open debate, and I call Claire Adamson to be followed by Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Government for bringing this debate to the Chamber today? I think it's very important, and I'd like to associate myself with the comments from the Cabinet Secretary regarding the importance of our schools at this very worrying period that we find ourselves in, about how a school is a place of safety for young people, where they can be sure of support and warm food and a nurturing environment. And if we learn any lessons from the COVID-19 crisis, it should be that we re-evaluate who are actually the key workers in our society, who we rely on to look after our children, to look after our elderly, to provide food, to stock our shops, and people who work in warehouses, all of whom are most likely to be in the most precarious working conditions in terms of the gig economy. And I hope that after we are through this crisis, that we can re-evaluate and look at our society from that lens. I do welcome the review that has taken place, and if I quote from the motion from the Government, I think it is really important that it's part of a wider drive to tackle key weaknesses in aspects of Scotland's schools education and the qualification structure, and that the Government agrees that the benefits that can be derived from all participants in the education system working together as part of a shared national endeavour to ensure Scotland's curriculum helps support Scotland's young people achieving their best possible outcomes. And I heard across the Chamber today that that is what is most of concern from the members who have taken part so far. And I welcome the consensual approach to actually using this as a springboard to actually improving those outcomes. I also want to thank the members, many of whom have mentioned the work of the committee. And if I could put my committee hat on for just a convener's hat on for just a second, I do think it's really, it's obvious that the work of the committee has been welcomed across the Chamber and by the Government, and I thank them for recognising that important work that we have been undertaking. And I can say today that we have written as a committee to the OECD, offering any expertise which we may be able to give to the process, and are willing to take part in that should the OECD think that's an appropriate way forward. And I look forward to seeing the review progress over the coming months, albeit it may be stalled because of the current global crisis. I think it's really important that we examine the scope of the review in terms of it's concerning the broad general education part of the curriculum, which has changed from older days. And I think it's really important. I say to Jamie Green that he was talking about having enjoyed 8 or 9 subject choices in third year. I think I'm considerably older than him. It was the same situation for me. But what has changed in Scottish education, I left school in 5th year. Most pupils did. It was an exception for pupils to stay on to 6th year when I went through the system. And I think we have to recognise that the society has changed, and the expectation now is to keep as many of our young people in some sort of education system until 6th year. And that means that we had to adapt what was happening, because before we always heard about the 2-term dash to higher. And it was really important that that senior phase was fulfilling right the way through from 4th year to 6th year to allow people to get the best results. I'll take an intervention from Mr.
Jamie Green.
Can I thank the member for taking my intervention? Can I just ask very simply then, if the member thinks that increased subject choice or decreased subject choice improves outcomes when it comes to opportunities for careers? Because from my point of view, the more subjects you have access to and available to you, the more choice you have to choose what's right for you.
Claire Adamson.
I think it's really wrong to look at this curriculum in the terms of what happens in a single year. It has to be the outcome for the person at the end of 6th year and the opportunities they have throughout the senior phase. So they may well have studied 8 to 9 subjects by the time they leave 6th year. They just might not have done it in 1 year. And that's the really important part of what we're trying to do here. And I think also that we have to recognise as well the success of the Developing the Young Workforce programme, and that many pupils are choosing not to have an SQA subject choice there, but maybe doing a foundation apprenticeship, maybe going to college, maybe doing a voluntary subject choice such as a Duke of Edinburgh Award, or something else that is all about building the capacity and the skills of our young people, but doesn't appear as a single subject choice on a single year. And I think the committee report made some observations that we need more data, and I thank Ross Greer for bringing that to the table in terms of, we didn't identify that there was an inequality just because there were fewer subject choices in areas of deprivation. We didn't have the data to show one way or the other, and that was one of the reasons we asked the government to consider a view of the final stage. If I could just finish by saying, in January this year, we quite often hear that it's a crisis and we're letting down a generation. But in January this year, Liz Smith was in the Times talking about access to university education. And then she said the current system is discriminatory, with many well-qualified domiciled Scots squeezed out. Now, I understand her concerns regarding the particular issue. However, what it showed was at a time when we have more Scottish domiciled students at university than ever before, we have many highly qualified young people competing for those places. And to me, that doesn't fit a narrative of failing a generation. I'm afraid I'm out of time. Sorry.
Have you concluded?
Yes,
Oh, you have.
officer,
All
sorry.
right. So you're taking an intervention role. I take Michelle Ballantyne, followed by Joanne Lamont. Ms Ballantyne.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Education is the most important universal right that we have embedded in our society because it does provide social mobility. And if we get education right, we know that it has a positive impact on health, on poverty, and on our economy. It should be our #1 priority because it is the area that underpins everything else. And a good education, once imparted, is yours for life. The Cabinet Secretary's motion today, I think, is carefully crafted because it does enable all sides of the chamber to support it. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't acknowledge that the SNP did resist undertaking this review at every turn. And at no stage has the Cabinet Secretary agreed or even acknowledged that the Curriculum for Excellence is in danger of becoming, and I've heard it said by some, an oxymoron. As a parent, I've had children in the Scottish education system for 30 years, and I continue to do so. And I have witnessed the weaknesses in the system growing. But it isn't about parental perception. The discussion we're going to have, and the one that the review needs to look at, is evidence. And some of the evidence we've been hearing when the curriculum was first being developed and implemented was the promise to make it a more holistic approach to education that built up the soft as well as the academic skills of pupils. It promised that teachers would have more flexibility in how they approach teaching and would be able to create a programme for learning that could dispense with potentially outmoded practices. These were promises that were warmly received by education experts and teachers alike, and they were heralded by politicians and industry leaders as a new way of ensuring that Scotland produces world-leading workers and citizens. Now, despite my own concerns about the introduction of Curriculum for Excellence, it would be very disingenuous to suggest that this was not seen as a positive proposal for Scottish education. The 2004 Curriculum Review Group report, which gave the curriculum its name, enjoyed support from all 5 main political parties. However, as the years have rolled on, concerns about implementation and impact has tarnished that policy. And Jamie Green's point about restoring trust, I believe, is quite right. You only have to look at subject choice, where parents see changes that they're not happy about. Prior to the abolition of standard grades in 2013 and the introduction of the National 4 and 5 qualifications, it was normal for schools to require pupils to sit 8 subjects. 20 years ago, 93% of schools in Scotland allowed 8 subjects at S4 level. 3/4 of young people used that choice and actually sat 8 subjects. Today, yes?
Claire Adamson.
So as someone who became a computer scientist and was only interested in science, I did do 8 subjects. I had to do 2 languages at my school, which were French and German. That wasn't a choice I would have made in a circumstance where I might have had an option to do something that was more interesting to me or something that was more relevant to where I wanted to go.
Michelle Ballantyne.
Yes, but then if I let my daughter choose, she'd probably only do 2 subjects. I think this is about ensuring that you have a broad education. And I do find it worrying that today only 10% of local authority schools actually offer 8 subjects, while in contrast, almost the entire independent sector still allow 8 subjects, which is driving parents to consider private education, even when they probably can't afford it, simply to give the choice that the state system no longer affords. In fact, you have to go back to the 1970s to find a time when such a low proportion of young people had access to a broad curriculum. So Curriculum for Excellence sought to change the way we taught our children by providing a multidisciplinary approach to learning, an education that would develop skills and critical thinking. And in themselves, these were positive ambitions, not without merit. But my long-held concern, both as a parent, a professional who worked with children in education, and particularly those who were school refusers, is that Curriculum for Excellence is not knowledge-based. In fact, if you actually read through the whole Curriculum for Excellence, very little mention is actually made of knowledge. Instead, we need to understand that the development of skills and the manipulation of information to facilitate higher thinking does require a core knowledge base embedded in the long-term memory. This change to curriculum design... Sorry?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Michelle Barton for giving way. I'm listening with interest to her speech, but I do feel she needs to be reminded that the core narrative of Curriculum for Excellence says Scotland's curriculum helps our children and young people gain the knowledge, skills and attributes needed for life in the 21st century. So I acknowledge the importance of knowledge being part of the curriculum and the experience that young people experience. Does Michelle Barton accept the point I've put on the record that that's built into the concept of Curriculum for Excellence? Michelle
Ballantyne.
I accept that the word is built into the descriptor at the front edge, but if you go through each section, there is no provision for example, ensuring that you have that foundation of embedded knowledge in your long-term memory that allows you to manipulate data, information, understanding. And that is why we are seeing some decline in performance. And if we don't address that, if we don't consider that as an issue, we will miss the very fundamentals that is causing a decline in our education. I'm clearly going to have to move on quite fast now because
no, you took some interventions. I'll let you make up your time.
Okay, thank you. And I think one of the problems we need to consider, and that in this review is absolutely critical, is the Scottish Government's withdrawal from all but one of the international education comparator studies and the scrapping of the valuable, what I consider valuable Scottish Survey of Literacy and Numeracy, means that the evidence on how our systems are performing, how our schools are performing, is now based on the annual school reports, which are based on teacher judgment. And whilst I have absolute respect for our teachers, I do believe this inevitably introduces the bias that humans are naturally inclined to. And I think that for the OECD review to have any potency, it must be able to explore in detail the relationship between the Curriculum for Excellence and education performance. And I'm concerned that the OECD will struggle to do this, and it will struggle to accurately chart this relationship while it is wandering in what was described by the Professor of Education Policy, Lindsay Patterson, as a data desert. So I do think the Scottish Government need to give some serious consideration, and I hope this review will point to that, in terms of the quality and quantity of its education data gathering to ensure that any future challenges that arise in education can be identified by bodies such as the OECD and then acted on quickly by government and not allow us to drift to the stage that we've got to in this stage. Because for this review to be meaningful, it must be independent and it must draw evidence from across educational thinking and experience. It must allow that freedom of speech of all contributors, whatever their position on Curriculum for Excellence, so that we can explore it thoroughly. And I absolutely think the role of Education Scotland, with responsibility for both curriculum development and inspection, needs and warrants review.
And that's where you must conclude. I have given you extra time. And I call Joanne Lamont, followed by Maureen Watt. Ms Lamont, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I welcome the opportunity to participate in this debate, although I think, like many others, I would confess to be rather distracted by other issues, despite the fact that over a long period of time expressing some concerns what's happening in the education system. But we are in uncharted waters now, and I just wanted to reflect before I make my main contribution on what I see as the role of schools, not just in their educational role, but in their social role. They're a community hub. They can be a place for sharing information, for wise counsel, helping people avoid panic, and also, crucially, for some children and young people, a place of sanctuary, nourishment, security, routine and care. And I wouldn't like to be in the position of the Cabinet Secretary having to decide what we do about our schools, because while the instinct is to say we should close them, we would lose a huge amount of important caring that goes on in our communities through the schools themselves. And I am sure that whatever that decision is, it will be done with that awareness very much in mind.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I place on record my appreciation of the understanding of the dilemma that Joanne Lamont has highlighted here, because as she has characterised, these are the absolute dilemmas that we are wrestling with because of the centrality that school represents in the stability of some young people's lives in our society today. So I'm grateful for her acknowledgement of that point.
Joanne Lamont.
Thank you. And I know that many families will be making decisions and be able to make decisions, but we do know that for some of our young people, school is an anchor in their lives, and we give that up at our peril. And I'm sure that you will also be thinking of, Cabinet Secretary will also thinking, how, if schools have to close, we can replicate that kind of support, that without which some young people will simply be put in immense difficulties. However, in relation to the review, I'd like to raise a number of issues which I trust any examination of the Curriculum for Excellence will include. The approach of Curriculum for Excellence did, of course, secure cross-party support, but many of the subsequent developments of Curriculum for Excellence were not foreseen, were not consulted upon, and I believe do not have that cross-party support, and indeed the support within our communities, amongst families and within the profession, I believe is in danger of being lost too, which is why this review is so important. Aspiration, of course, is easy to sign up for, but we do need to be vigilant about delivery. And I would give us one example of a concern I have had, is the decision not to have an external exam at the end of S4 for many students who were doing that for. Astonishingly, in my time in the Education Committee, we were not even able to establish who had made that decision, never mind whether the decision was a good one or not. And I saw directly the benefits in my teaching career for many young people back in the day of what was called certification for all. That is that schools had to provide courses externally tested that met the needs of all our young people, that valued them all and treated them all with respect. And it is a concern that some young people may now leave without any qualifications whatsoever, and a sense that, again, we may be going back to the world of certificate and non-certificate classes, which did abandon many young people when they, with a bit of support, they could have achieved a great deal more. I also would suggest that the context of year-on-year cuts to local authorities have had an impact on the effectiveness in our schools, and I'm sure that any review would be looking at that too. The truth is that the reduction in support staff and personal assistants, the decrease, if not ending, of learning support, educational psychologists, behavioural support, group workers, school nurses, home links workers, All these have had in the past played a critical role in supporting young people, and they are critical means to bridge the gulf in opportunities for all too many young people in our education system, whether because of their family circumstances, because they're disabled, because they're autistic, or face other barriers that create daily challenges. And it does seem to me that there's an irony that while some of the most disadvantaged young people see that kind of support stopped or disappearing, we see the increased use of private tutors for those who can afford it to maximise their achievements. And I would urge any examination of the decisions around the implementation of Curriculum for Excellence to be underpinned by a rigorous equality impact assessment, testing decisions that, far from confronting inequality, are in danger of reinforcing inequality and disadvantage. Issues like multi-level courses, there is a fear that these are driven by personnel management, timetabling difficulties that are not about education itself. I would contend that young people who are doing a subject for the first time in fourth year are at a level of maturity and ability which is way different from a youngster who is at the stage where they're doing an advanced higher. I could not have taught that in a class that I had, while I did manage to teach general foundation, general certificate. The gulf is immense, and I think the age gap in itself is significant and should be acknowledged. And just because it's convenient for the timetablers is not an educational reason for it to be done. I am concerned too about subject choices. I think there is an issue around core subjects which we need to discuss, and we need to hear more from those with expertise about that. Some theoretical freedom of choice, which actually results in a lot of young people having very limited choices within, they might only, not just number, they may only have 6 subjects, but the choices within that, I would contend, are a difficulty as well, if we're not going to have a sense of what the core subjects within our curriculum might be. I believe it is essential and trust that the review will examine how the issues of how external examinations, subject choices, multi-level teaching have a direct impact on those already disadvantaged in the system, and thus reinforcing the evident gap in attainment and not challenging it. Multi-level teaching will be more prevalent in schools where the number of young people taking a full group of hires or advanced hires is fewer. If there are plenty of young people doing hires, they will not be in multi-level classes, and as a consequence, those already achieving or who are fully supported are learning in a less disrupted set of circumstances.
Can you wind up, please?
There are key issues, I think, around subject choice, multi-level teaching, and so on, but I do welcome the review, and I think there has to be acknowledgement that those who are highlighting the problems were not the problem, and I think this is the opportunity for the Cabinet Secretary, through the review, to listen to those who do have the expertise in the field, whether they're teachers or are working in schools and supporting young people, and I believe that they need to be the heart of the review itself.
Thank you. I call Maureen Watt, to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson. Ms Watt, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's really important that any education system in any country is open to review, and that applies to our own in Scotland, although it's probably been reviewed and scrutinised more than most. Curriculum for Excellence, as was said, was started by the LibLab executive with the support of the whole Parliament and fell largely to be implemented by the SNP government from 2007 onwards. Of course, any new system had to be implemented gradually through the system, and implementation in primary was smooth and welcomed. Children were looking forward to continuing with Curriculum for Excellence in secondary school, and most did smoothly. And where teachers did not feel confident in their implementation of it, they were given extra assistance from national bodies. Our young people were not to be taught to the test, but through their individual learning to become successful learners, confident individuals, responsible citizens, and effective contributors. The OECD review published in 2015 said, "There is a great deal to be positive about. Learners are enthusiastic and motivated, teachers are engaged and professional, and system leaders are highly committed. There has been intensive activity to create suites of support materials and a drive to address excessive bureaucracy. There have been extensive professional learning events organised throughout Scotland. Curriculum for Excellence has been anchored in consensus and a wide set of parallel reforms. These include teacher education, extensive work on qualifications, and vocational education and training, and the establishment of a National Parents Forum and a new leadership college. In the conclusions and recommendations of that report, it said, in the next phase of the Curriculum for Excellence journey, Scotland has the opportunity to lead the world in developing an innovative national assessment, evaluation and improvement framework that is consistent with what is known about promoting student, professional, school and system learning. The current system has a strong formative emphasis for the players at each of these levels and other stakeholders through the development of carefully constructed processes of assessment, evaluation and appraisal. These processes are informed by research about how to promote positive outcomes for learners, their teachers and their leaders. It goes on to say the challenge now is to construct systems and processes to develop this more robust evidential platform on which to base judgments about the health of the system at all levels while retaining the strong developmental and improvement emphasis. This is not an easy task because the potential for narrowing and distorting the curriculum and undermining the professional judgments of teachers is real. Scotland, however, has demonstrated innovative ways to use benchmarked information to inform development in upper secondary schooling through its Insight tool. Education Scotland, together with the complementary expertise of others within the system, now has the opportunity to develop similar innovative processes for the years of the broad general education in ways that support and the continued development of curriculum for excellence. So that, I presume, is what the new review will drill down upon. But much has also changed and developed in the education system since the inception of Curriculum for Excellence. The increase in nursery education hours has and will have effect on our children, and the building on play-based learning will no doubt show a great effect, and I'm sure all of us who go into our nursery and primary schools will know how inquisitive and engaged these pupils are. However, there's no doubt that most concerns have been around the senior phase, and if the results of this new study and report can help with that, it is to be welcomed. But having visited one of my larger secondary schools recently, they're concerned that much of this criticism is totally unfounded, not landing with parents, and only serving to undermine the confidence of staff who all want to do their best for their pupils. Some of us who took part in Jamie Halker-Johnson's debate on Apprenticeship Week last week will know that I recounted my learning experience of the positive value of foundation apprenticeships and how they're not only giving pupils work experience in a wide variety of settings, especially in areas of the economy where we're always likely to need workers, but how they attract higher passes and higher passes at a high level. I learned at first hand how they're also helping to close the attainment gap by witnessing access to watching some pupils doing their healthcare foundation apprenticeship in Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. And I heard from one grateful parent, a GP whose daughter was on the way to disengaging from school, but had started one of these apprenticeship programs, how she loved it and saw the value of not only this apprenticeship, but her other subjects. And the parents said that all pupils should be having to do foundation apprenticeships.
Thank you. Now, I must ask you to conclude there, please.
Oh, yes, so, Presiding Officer, there's no doubt that some work does need to be done to help our poorer performing schools, but hopefully this review will show that.
I'm sorry, I did a bit of drama there about what conclude means. Jamie Halker-Johnson, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the Scottish Government bringing forward this debate to the Chamber today. Along with other opposition parties, we've pressed for a considerable time for an education debate in government time. Education is one of the Parliament's primary functions, as well as being stated in more normal times at least, to be the foremost priority of this government. Despite the importance attached to it, though, it has become increasingly clear that we've seen a falling standards across many areas of schooling, despite the efforts of staff and teachers. And others have, as others have mentioned today and highlighted, I know many of those teachers will be concerned at the moment as we look to the situation around the coronavirus outbreak and the possible impact the potential absences and resultant organisational issues might have on their work and, of course, on their personal circumstances. I'm sure that ministers will be looking to allay their fears as much as possible and will have very difficult decisions to make at this time, and I'm sure they'll have the support of these benches as they make those decisions. This debate feels a little uncomfortable because of that, but also slightly reassuring because as we look to the future, post the current crisis, this review of Curriculum for Excellence can, if properly handled, be an important step in restoring Scotland's reputation for education. We should keep in mind, however, that a curriculum can only ever be as good as the system that supports it. This is, of course, a focus on implementation of the curriculum. However, there remains a wider question over whether some of the policy assumptions behind CFE remains appropriate. Equally, we should be able to consider the curriculum at a distance from other areas of school performance. There is a broader question of capacity in our schools. We have fewer teachers and regular concerns about teacher workload and staffing continue to be raised. This inevitably has an impact on how the curriculum is delivered, but these issues are distinct from it. They will, however, add pressure to how the curriculum is received. We can look, for example, to the questions around multi-level teaching, which I'm sure no one would suggest is inherently desirable. Similarly, our qualifications framework, altered in tandem with major curriculum reform, also has significant implications. So it's welcome that the Scottish Government's motion today recognises that, and I quote, this review must form part of a wider drive to tackle key weaknesses in aspects of Scotland's school education and the qualifications structure. Because too often in this chamber we've seen legitimate concerns battered away. Too often we have seen particular narratives pressed until they bear little relation to parents, teachers and pupils' experiences. However, we should be heartened that across parties in this chamber there's been a willingness to listen on education. While we may differ on ideas, there is a willingness to work together in the common interest of pupils. We saw that with the initial development of Curriculum for Excellence many years ago. So should the Education Secretary wish to drive forward constructive change, he will find other members willing to listen. With that in mind, it is important that this Parliament, as this Parliament has previously recognised, that the review takes account of both the broad general education phase and senior phase, and the transition between the two. It must be an honest and thorough assessment of where we stand. And as the government's motion seems to recognise, this goes beyond the remit of the OECD review. In responding to the review, it will also be a time for ministers and other parties to address some of the wider concerns around secondary education. Simply adjusting the curriculum and its delivery in isolation will not make the marked improvements that is required. Such an assessment will require a level of honesty about shortcomings. On attainment, for example, I've seen repeated in this chamber an assertion that exam results are not everything we should look for in pupils. That is true. A young person's educational journey is a wider process of personal development. However, whenever a variation of this phrase is uttered, its motive seems to always be a justification for a fall in attainment. So perhaps we should reflect that attainment does matter, that it is at the core of what our schools exist for. Results will determine the future career prospects of young people, as well as their later educational journey will go. Now, there seems to have been finally some acceptance that the trends in results are more than just annual fluctuation. When the quality of our education system drives down results, it reduces opportunity, and it fails our young people, passing over their abilities and hampering their aspirations. Equally, when we restrict opportunity, as we've seen in the discussions about subject choices, we reduce the horizons of these young people early in their lives. STEM subjects can create a generation ready to take on the jobs of the future. Modern languages can open up entirely new worlds to a person. Falling attainment cannot be a legacy any party should wish to leave behind. There is also the question of how fundamentals are taught. We now have one recognised international comparator for pupil attainment, the PISA figures, and results continue to be concerning. Whatever comes out of the OECD review, a real focus from the Scottish Government on literacy and numeracy will be important at this stage. Presiding Officer, as a new member of the Education and Skills Committee, I've not contributed to some of the work it's done in this area over the last year. That work has driven forward the examination of Curriculum for Excellence in a useful and constructive way. There has been, however, a tendency within the Scottish Government to claim that all is well with our schools, when that is patently not true. We do have to wonder whether, if it is not for external pressure, that this review would ever have been taking place. The value in the review will be in the ability of ministers to take on board its eventual recommendations and be willing to change, to demonstrate some flexibility, and to accept seriously that there are legitimate issues to contend with as we go forward.
And now you must conclude. Thank you very much. I now call Sarah Boyack to be followed by Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think this has been a good debate, which has been important in highlighting precisely why we need this review. And while acknowledging the comments that colleagues have made about the challenges over the next few months that our schools, our local authorities, our teachers, and indeed our young people will face, we need to find the space to ensure that this review is going to be successful. And I think when looking at this debate, we mustn't lose sight of the wider issue of the local government picture, as it's local government who provides our children education, run our schools, and who pay our teachers. And education is this government's top priority. Yet the underfunding of local government is pushing tough decisions onto our schools and councils. And we could see that in this year's budget, with really good proposals, expansion of early learning and childcare, work on teachers' pensions, the issue about additional support for learning, good policies. But the fact that local government is going to be collectively underfunded by over 200 million is going to add pressure. And that's something that should concern us. Because one of the issues that was recorded by the Education Committee that we need to think about is the issue of the importance of teacher shortages in certain areas and how that impacts on the ground. So we need to make sure that in addition to having this review, it's critical to think about investment as the basis for success. And it is vital for us because quality education has long been known as a leveller. A key tool in tackling inequality, education is something we've traditionally been hugely proud of in Scotland, but we're not seeing delivery on the ground. I think the points that Claire Adamson made about additional skills being important to giving school students that extra value when they leave school. Let's look at some of the tough choices that local authorities are now making. Looking at staff numbers, having to charge for music tuition. Those things are critical in terms of impacting on the quality of education that our school students get. In my own council, the tough choice of having to take over 17 million out of the education revenue budget to pay for new schools and to make sure that they invest and refurb the school estate. Now that's vital because in education, our population is growing by 26% over the next 2 decades. So we've got to make sure that while we look at this review, we make sure we have the investment to ensure that whatever recommendations it comes up with, they are capable of being implemented properly. Because if we look at what's happening at the moment, attainment levels at higher have fallen for the 4th year in a row. Pupils aren't enrolling in qualifications. Professor Jim Scott has calculated that we've seen almost 1 million qualifications being lost since the new national exams were introduced. That isn't good enough. We need to see that schools don't struggle to keep teachers or provide a broad range of subjects. We need to do better. This is an accidental attainment gap which is failing students across Scotland. Now, colleagues have talked about subject choices, and those students getting to study 8 or 9 Nat 4s and 5s are able to do so not because of academic ability, but of where they go to school. Pupils in independent schools are more likely to study 8 or 9 subjects, but for those in the state sector, it is a postcode lottery which decides what you can study. So those students leaving school straight afterwards could be doing so with fewer qualifications and facing an immediate disadvantage in the job market. That is just not acceptable, and that needs to change. So we urgently need to see the crisis of resourcing addressed in our classrooms to tackle teacher recruitment and workloads, while at the same time we have this review. And the Education Committee has raised important concerns that need to be addressed about the overall responsibility for curriculum structure and subject availability. And they also agreed, interestingly, that there's a continued confusion about the responsibilities of Education Scotland and that it's failing to provide adequate support for the continuing implementation of curriculum for excellence. So there are key issues that need to be fixed in our schools, and we urgently need to see those addressed. So this OECD review is timely, and Professor Jim Scott has stated that we are in danger of a generation going past who have not had a good experience in education. A generation of young people who've been failed by SNP mismanagement and underfunding. That's good enough. So this review really needs to be successful. It needs to be conducted, it needs to have an input from our Education Committee, and it needs to be open and transparent so that parents and young people who've been through that system can engage in it themselves. It's crucial and it's important that we're discussing it today, but it's got to be a success. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Ms Bork. I call Alistair Allen to be followed by Brian Whittle. Mr Whittle is the last speaker in the open debate. Alistair Allen, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the midst of some of the recent coverage of Curriculum for Excellence, it would be easy to forget that there is, or there certainly should be, a cross-party consensus about CFE itself and about the achievement of Scotland's schools, teachers and young people. All parties have a hand one way or another in the development of Scotland's modern classrooms and have a reason to be proud of their success, but particularly possibly the Scottish Government. We're all entitled to seek to improve things in Scotland's schools. Indeed, we have an obligation to do so, and the Government's review recognises that fact. However, politicians who sometimes cast wider, more fundamental doubts about Curriculum for Excellence have a duty to say whether they have some other preferable spare curriculum to hand. Indeed, they should recognise that in some ways Curriculum for Excellence, despite its name, does not lay claim to being a curriculum in the most traditional sense of the word at all. Unlike his apocryphal French counterpart, Scotland's Education Minister has never been able to look at his watch and know that third years across the country are all doing double maths. Nor has the Scottish Government ever sought that degree of uniformity. Instead, the Curriculum for Excellence gives schools the freedom and flexibility to design a curriculum that best meets the needs of their learners, with decisions about curriculum design, learner pathways and presentation for qualifications taken by schools and, of course, by young people themselves. Head teachers already have to take account of the national framework for Scotland's curriculum, along with the needs of their own school, of their own community, as agreed between schools and local councils. And we should now look at the OECD review as a way of improving something that is good, rather than a means of rehearsing familiar political grievances. Young people, schools and local authorities will be at the heart of this review, and the OECD will listen to their feedback, I am sure, on this and other areas before producing their report. As this Parliament's Education Committee and others have indicated, indeed as others have indicated today, that will mean looking at several questions in depth, one such being around the balance between skills and knowledge. Now, though I would personally come down in that argument firmly on the side that says that knowing stuff is far more likely to be a consolation to you than not knowing it, and that the joy to be derived from learning something is in inverse proportion to its potential or likely usefulness, there is a balance to be struck, and the review will, I hope, help us to do just that. So the review will look at curriculum design. It will look at the depth and breadth of learning in the senior phase. It will look at local flexibility versus the questions around prescription that some members have raised today or alluded to. It will look at the transition from the broad general education into the senior phase. And on subject choice, I welcome the fact that the review is looking at this question again. And again, I believe we have to start with a recognition of what is working. More young people are coming out of more schools with more qualifications than ever before. More young people are staying on, as has been mentioned, to sixth year with all the opportunities that that brings. The measure of all this is what qualifications people leave school with, not which subjects they study in any one specific year. However, that said, there are legitimate questions to be asked about what is happening to some specific subjects. Languages in particular have been mentioned today, and whether there is a way to ensure that the numbers taking them do not continue to decline, as they have certainly done in recent years. We have to ensure that languages, if they are not being taken in fourth year, are being taken at some other stage in the school career. And I'm sure that the review will also take views on decisions which many schools are making with regard to multi-level classes. Presiding Officer, neither this Parliament nor this review should flinch from any of these difficult questions, but it is a debate that we should have grounded in an understanding of what actually goes on inside Scotland's state schools, an understanding which has not always been evident from some political commentators or from the sometimes nostalgic view of education that has been uttered from some quarters that seems to spring from a much rosier recollection of the 1980s than I have myself. Improving education is the defining mission of the Scottish Government, and this commitment is being backed with significant investment. We know that closing the attainment gap will take time, but what we are doing is having a real and measurable effect, and that is why head teachers back the Scottish Government's plans. A record 95% of school leavers were in positive destinations such as study, work or training about 3 months after leaving school last year. And I'm proud to say that my own local authority was, I think, at the top of that particular set of statistics. Presiding Officer, the OECD review provides a real chance to build on all the work going on in Scotland's schools and deserves of us as politicians a serious response which I hope will be reflected or has been reflected today in Parliament.
Thank you very much, Mr Allen. I call Brian Whittle, please. Mr Whittle.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by reminding the Chamber that I have a daughter who is a secondary school teacher. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak in today's debate. Now, as you know, Deputy Presiding Officer, my specific remit and my passion lies in improving the health of our nation, especially given Scotland's poor health report card, which is all too stark given the current situation in which we find ourselves in. However, I strongly believe that education and health are intrinsically linked. In fact, as I've said in this place many times, I think education is the solution to health and welfare. So when looking at Curriculum for Excellence and its aims, it is entirely right that those aims are supported across this chamber. Excellence and equity, principles that we should all want for our children. That holistic learning is a key element of Curriculum for Excellence. Now, my colleagues and MSPs from across the chamber have talked about academic achievement and a relative decline in some aspects of that attainment. And that, of course, is fundamental measurement of success or otherwise in this policy. After all, to a greater extent, the qualifications achieved at school will dictate potential pathways for a pupil's career. However, as you know, Deputy Presiding Officer, this is not the only measurement by which we should judge our education system. I believe that well-being, both physical and mental, should sit within the educational brief, not just in the health portfolio. I think to achieve equity and excellence, those twin pillars of Curriculum for Excellence, access to opportunity is a prerequisite. Taking part in activities that enable social inclusion help to develop interpersonal skills, confidence and resilience. These skills are fundamental to the long-term chances of our children. Now, we're talking about access to sport and activity, art, music and drama. Yes, Deputy Presiding Officer, I'm backing that hobby horse again. My concern is that opportunities to take part in these activities, opportunities that I took for granted in my school days, have been steadily eroded over a number of years. Decades, in fact, I think all the way back to the teacher strike in the mid-80s and even before that. I think the introduction of Curriculum for Excellence was an opportunity to tackle this issue. However, the feedback from teachers is that timetabling and an increase in paperwork has seen a continuing decline in opportunities to participate. I think furthermore, extracurricular activity is not universally available. Again, an increase in paperwork has been cited by teachers, and I would also highlight the lack of access to the school estate after hours for third sector groups. I think that's a major issue. I think Joanne Lamont, I was really pleased to hear her talk about the importance of school as a social hub. I think that's a key element I think we have to grasp, especially in the current climate. I think it's highlighted very much in the current climate, but I think it always should be that social hub, out with just the traditional educational element. I think the fact that music tuition in schools is no longer free in 26 of 32 local authorities, I think the decline in the opportunities to play sport, to participate in art and drama in school, reduces the opportunities to excel and also does not speak to equity. This is important because we know that being physically active positively impacts both physical and mental health. We know that being physically active at a young age makes it more likely that our young people will be physically active when they are older and throughout their lives. And we know that social inclusion helps to develop skills like confidence and resilience, positive traits like application and reward for effort, and that importance of self-discipline. Skills that are so important to achieve in the classroom. If we want to not only take on and tackle the attainment gap, but we want to tackle issues of preventable health, of drug and alcohol addiction, of poor mental health and obesity and type 2 diabetes, COPD and musculoskeletal conditions, and on, I believe that the opportunities in school to participate form the cornerstone of what tackles those issues. I also believe that this approach is entirely consistent with the objectives of Curriculum for Excellence. In fact, I'd go further than that and say that I believe that we can't fully realise the potential of Curriculum for Excellence without including how music, art, drama and sport can become an integral part of every pupil's lives. These activities can have such a positive influence on a young person's life. And I could give you dozens of examples from people I've met throughout my life, examples of how a chance meeting with a teacher who encouraged and nurtured an interest shaped a person's life. My own life included. Deputy Presiding Officer, Primary 1 school sports at Symington Primary Schools, where I discovered I could run a bit faster than most. And I was supported throughout my school life by teachers, encouraged to represent the school, and they ended up at the British schools. Now, and every sportsman and woman, actor or actress or musician or artist can tell you a similar story. These are skills that follow you through life. Now, the fact that those skills, that pathway has led me here, Deputy Presiding Officer, might not be such a persuasive argument for the Cabinet Secretary, but I hope that he accepts the principle of the debate. I want to give one more example. I was visiting the prison recently, and I bumped into a prisoner who was taking part in art, and it was phenomenal. It was art of the highest quality, and I said to him, in his 8 years he had in prison, why did it take you to come to prison to learn you could do that? And he said, because I didn't have the opportunity before. And I thought, 8 years, the big question is, would he have spent 8 years at £34,000 a year had he had that skill at school? Now, if you want, I think we need to free up a teacher's time to allow them to teach, to deliver all they are trained to do and what they want to do. And if we do, Deputy Presiding Officer, we may just find that the stubborn attainment gap begins to close.
Thank you very much. I now call Ian Gray to close for Labour. Mr Gray, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Ross Greer described today's debate earlier as a bit surreal, and I think he was really referring to the background of coronavirus and so on. But there's been one or two slightly odd aspects of today's debate. One of them is that we have not spent any of the debate, I think, exchanging statistics with each other to try and, in our case, convince that there's a problem, and in the Cabinet Secretary's case, convince that he's got his statistics there, they're still coming, right? Goodo. I'm sure for anybody, if there is anybody in the world who watches our education debates, then that would be a great relief. But I'm being light about quite an important point here, because, of course, one of the recommendations of the previous OECD review was to increase the data available in the school system. And the Education Secretary took that very seriously and often says that we now have more data available than ever before. And the thing is, that claim is largely based on the gathering of the Achievement of Curriculum for Excellence level ACEL results, and on the introduction behind that of the National Literacy and Numeracy Test. But the truth is that all of that replaced the Scottish Schools Literacy and Numeracy Survey, which was firstly statistically rigorous, and secondly providing a run of data going back some years. And the truth is that neither SNSA or ACEL have really established a reputation for rigour amongst educationalists. The First Minister often claims, I think still claims, that they are better than the survey was because they are universal, not a survey, so they test everyone. And that, of course, is simply nonsense, since ministers have indeed conceded that the SNSA is not a normative assessment which can be added up in that way. They don't really tell us with certainty how the system is doing it. But to be honest, even if they did, we would still have problems with judging success in our schools. For our schools, I mean, not for individual pupils. Because the government have gone down the path of developing a basket of measures of attainment. Another response, apparently, to the OECD requirement to have more data available. But what that actually means is that we simply can't agree on how attainment is to be judged, or even whether the government's top priority of closing the attainment gap is being progressed. The Education Secretary, for example, likes to use the percentage of pupils achieving at least one higher or National 5 exam. But in truth, one higher or one National 5 doesn't really open many doors. The figures for achieving 3 or even 5 exam passes at any level are arguably much more useful. But of course, they're less favourable as things stand today to the government, so they get left in that basket, and the at least one at National 5 or above comes out. Similarly, we're often told we should judge success on pupil outcomes, what they leave school with, yet this year exam results of school leavers show declines in pupils achieving even one or more qualification at level 5 or above. They show the attainment gap widening, not closing, and where it is closing, it's closing because high attainers are doing worse quicker. None of that suits the government narrative, so they move away then from school leaver outcomes and move back to focus on 1 year's diet rather than leavers. Look, the issue here is that we really need to reach some kind of agreement on how we judge the performance, not of individual pupils, but of the system and of education policy. And if the OECD would advise on that, that would be helpful, I think. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on something which the Education Secretary brought up and we haven't really returned to. Because another argument that we've had over some months is whether the curriculum is narrowing, or subject choice is reducing, or it is growing. And part of the confusion there, of course, is that the Education Secretary will often argue that the range of courses from which pupils can choose has increased. And I think that is true, and it's true not least because of the increase in vocational-based courses available, and Mr Swinney did mention this, foundation apprenticeships, Maureen Watt spoke about, and other vocational options. And that is a very, very good thing, but it does need examination, and it's also part of this problem about judging success in the system. Because if we are to judge the performance of the system, not just on hires and nationals, we're going to have to find a way of recognising attainment in those vocational courses, which firstly gains acceptance, and which is clearly equivalent with traditional exams, not just the same SCQF level, but in the way it's accepted by FE, by HE, and by employers and parents as well. And we haven't reached that stage yet, and I think that is part of the issue. I'm kind of in my last minute, so. Doing that would be a big change in attitudes which have persisted for decades now. And of course, Joanne Lamont referred to one issue, which is that the committee has heard evidence that in schools serving deprived communities, they are more likely to offer more of those courses to more of their pupils than schools in better off parts of Scotland, where they, it would appear, perhaps focus on offering 7 or 8 of the traditional exams instead, really by subverting sometimes the 3+3 model. Joanne Lamont is right. That two-track approach is not acceptable, and I was very pleased to hear that the Deputy First Minister is going to commission work to find out more about that. Listen, there are a lot of issues to be covered by this review now. It's an extremely important move by the government. It's very welcome, and I look forward to, hopefully in a year or so, that it's not delayed, seeing what the outcome of the work is.
Thank you very much, and I call Liz Smith to close for the Conservatives. You have 9 minutes or thereabouts.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I want to pick up on several points that have been raised this afternoon. But before I do so, can we just set the context of this, and including the excellent point that was made by Joanne Lamont, that schools are more than just about education, they're about the social cohesion of our society, and I think that's a very important point that Joanne Lamont made. Now, when the OECD produced its very important and comprehensive report into school education in Scotland in 2014, it prioritised some key recommendations. It was very clear, and I think Maureen Watt raised this in her speech, it was very clear that the principles behind the curriculum for excellence were the right ones, that the twin ambitions of excellence and equity should underpin all aspects of education policy, and they certainly should. And it had very many good things to say about the approach to holistic learning, which incidentally, Cabinet Secretary, I think is one of the reasons why we are very keen that BGE is included in this review, because I think the holistic approach to education is something that is very important. So there were good things, and I think we should acknowledge that, because I think it's very important that we see it in that context. And it's quite clearly the main reason why all the parties around this chamber at the time agreed very much with the Minister, Peter Peacock, that the curriculum for excellence was the right approach in its basic principles for the 21st century. That report, however, in 2014 did warn of some key significant challenges, and that was very much to do with the delivery of the curriculum for excellence, not so much the principles, but the actual delivery, because it did highlight that there were absolute, and in some cases relative, decline in some aspects of attainment, mathematics being its primary focus at that time. And I think we have to look at the situation 5 years on, where sadly mathematics is still an issue in our schools. But it also looked at the concerns about what we have to do to evaluate the curriculum for excellence, and Ian Gray's just made some very strong points on that. Because there is a data issue. The Cabinet Secretary has said several times, I think he said in answer to my colleague Jamie Halcrow-Johnson at Education Questions last week, that schools now have more data than ever before. And that may be true in some cases, but I think there are a lot of issues about how we interpret that data. I think Beatrice Wishart, when she made her points in her speech, and Ian Gray's made the same points, that we still have some debates about how to interpret the information, particularly when it comes to the testing, what the purpose of that testing is, and how we actually measure it. So I think these are critical, because, as Ian Gray rightly points out, we're not going to be able to say how well we are progressing if we don't sort out these basic questions. And that said, there is no doubt that the Curriculum for Excellence was designed to build on the widely acknowledged strengths of Scottish education. We should never forget what these are, and to ensure that schools can build on a different society, but also a change of culture. And I think the Cabinet Secretary has said several times on education issues in the last little while that we need a change of culture. I think we do. I think we need a different approach. But as I have said in quite a number of debates, let that never be the excuse for saying that we can't address some of the current problems within Scottish education. We have to do both. We have to ensure that we're working within that new culture, but we're also addressing a lot of the problems, because we have to acknowledge that these do exist. Now, the Cabinet Secretary often cites the increase in the number of new qualifications that are available, and this was a point raised by Claire Adamson as well, and by Alistair Allen. I think that is true, but it comes down to the fact, back to this debate about what it means to have a core curriculum. Because I think there is a debate to be had, and I'm glad to say that the Cabinet Secretary accepts that. There is a debate about what the core curriculum actually means, what it means to parents, what it means to pupils, what it means to teachers. And I think it's time that we had that debate about what should be on that core curriculum. I think Brian Whittle made some good points about some of the extra dimensions within that core curriculum. So it's not just about having a lot of new qualifications, these are welcome, but it is about ensuring that the core curriculum, which is a very important part, I think, of many people's education. I think it's what employers are looking for. That debate is crucial in the context of the OECD qualifications. And I think that attainment in different core subjects is a matter of concern. Because, and again, back to Alistair Allen, he's said this consistently at committee, he said it again in the chamber, we do have issues about decline in certain subjects, in languages, in STEM, and I think we have to be looking at whether there is a progression issue about this. And again, that's another reason why I think we should come back to see this as a holistic approach between BGE and the senior phase, that it really matters about what subjects you do or are able to do at what levels. And if some are progressive, it's very difficult to come back to them later on in your school career. So I think these are part and parcel of some of the issues that I think the OECD should be looking at. I think when it comes to the subject choice section of this overview, I think that perhaps is one of the most critical things that we have to examine. Because quite clearly from what the Education Committee's evidence has been over a long period of time, there are fundamental issues about some subject choice concerns. And whether that affects people who are from better off backgrounds, Sarah Boyatt made this point, it is quite clearly true in some schools that parents feel that because they don't have the same opportunities as other schools, their youngsters lose out. And I think there's a concern as to how that affects colleges and universities and the world of work, even more importantly. So it is a worry that we have some significant concerns about that. And also there are some really quite serious concerns about the percentage of the school leaver population in some local authorities, by no means all, who are leaving school without very much at all, even within the context of some different qualifications. And that's a matter which I think it is very important that collectively parliamentarians are seen to address. In 2016, Dr. Mark Priestley said something very interesting about the Curriculum for Excellence, that it was very much built upon the right founding principles, but the structure might have to change in order to deliver the better results. And I come back to the points that Mark Priestley raised at the time, because I think he agreed with the OECD that its implementation had at that stage been incomplete, and that goes without saying, but there had to be a much clearer process for curriculum development, where the responsibility for whoever's deciding on that was completely clear, and we've seen issues about Education Scotland and SQA's role in that, but also that there should be the accountability element. And again, I think that's something I would like to see personally, and Cabinet Secretary knows this, it's been part of my issue with what we've been doing for quite some time. So I come back to this on the issue about the Education Committee's concerns over the lack of clarity about who's been in charge in terms of decision-making. Joanne Lamont made the good point about who made the decision over whether the National 4 qualification should have an external exam or not. She's quite right to point to there's a debate about that, but we couldn't actually get to the nub of who had made that decision. And that's something that we just cannot have going forward. It is just so crucial that we know why decisions are made, who's taking them, and who will be accountable for it. Finally, Deputy Presiding Officer, the OECD in 2014 described Curriculum for Excellence as a watershed moment. That was their phrase. It found the levels of academic achievement were above international average levels in science and reading, but it did highlight very considerable concerns about maths, and we're still there. We have not moved on from that. We are still there with maths. It said that social inclusion in Scottish schools was very encouraging. The attitudes to school life were generally positive, although they had some worry about whether these declined a little bit in secondary school. But it also found that 1/5 of schools were no better than satisfactory. And that is one of the crucial outcomes that we need to be addressing. There is something far wrong if we cannot find a better way of ensuring that all our schools are more than satisfactory. And with that, Deputy Presiding Officer, I'll finish my comments.
Thank you very much. And I call on John Swinney to close the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, 11 minutes or thereabouts, please.
Presiding Officer, this has been a very, very good debate. It makes me wonder why the Government hasn't had more debates on education. It's been such an enjoyable afternoon. So I'll take that away and reflect on that in the light of the discussion. And I'm glad that it was Ian Gray that sullied the debate with statistics. I have my usual compendium here ready to deliver, but I shall not detain Parliament on those issues. I'll detain Parliament on the much more interesting things that were said by members. And where I want to start is the comment made by my colleague Maureen Watt, who recounted the experience of visiting one of the secondary schools in her constituency and talked about how she'd seen a practical example of a young person who had been able to re-engage with education by virtue of their participation in a foundation apprenticeship. And I've had the pleasure of having many conversations of that type in different schools around the country, where it has not been the pursuit of national qualifications that has met the needs of particular young people, although I appreciate national qualifications are important in our system. It was the fact that a pathway was available that met the needs of that young person, which sustained their engagement. And had it not been available, it is likely that they would have disengaged from education. And I think that's one of the big improvements that's been made. And I was mindful of that when I listened to Mr. Whittle's story about the prisoner. Because in a sense, the story that Mr. Whittle recounted, I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but I would hazard a guess that that individual had probably disengaged from education, not because of any active decision on their part, but because probably education didn't interest them or engage them. And I'll let Mr. Whittle in a second. And what I think is now much more the case is that we are looking at our education system is now increasingly looking at individual young people and finding the routes that enable them to remain engaged in education and to make progress. And I think that's a product of Curriculum for Excellence. I'm very happy to give way to Mr. Whittle.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way, but in searching for these ways to re-engage pupils who are probably not engaged in general school term, we had those engagements all the way through our school life, and what I'm trying to do is shine a light back on that sort of engagement to see whether we can bring that back.
Cabinet Secretary.
I had a slightly different experience in my school days. School worked perfectly for me. It served me absolutely fantastically well, and it got me everything I needed to get on with the rest of my life. But there were lots of my peers that it didn't serve well for the experience that results in exactly the type of journey that Mr. Whittle has recounted. So I'm all for finding the ways that we engage individual learners to engage them in our learning. And I think CFE enables us to do that. I'm very happy to give way.
Liz Smith.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. In that context, I think the Cabinet Secretary makes a very good point. Will he consider having a look at the different kinds of models of schooling, Newlands Junior College being one classic example that was doing very good work for a lot of disengaged youngsters? Will he consider and undertake to have a look at that?
I think the issue is about what does our education system deliver, because I've got to be able to be satisfied that in every single part of the country, wherever a young person lives, they can go into a school and it can meet their needs. And if you live in rural Perthshire, where I live, and Newlands Junior Secondary School is the only option available to disengaged learning, that doesn't meet their needs. What has to be the case is that the local schools in Perthshire have got to meet the needs of every single young person coming in the door. Now, in that respect, Alistair Allen is absolutely correct that CFE gives schools the freedom and the flexibility to meet the needs of learners in their own circumstances. And of course, many schools have done exactly what Claire Adamson talked about, which is take forward the Developing Scotland's Young Workforce agenda, which enables a much greater configuration of educational pathways to be delivered to meet the needs of individual learners. Now, of course...
Michelle Ballantyne.
I was just sitting here trying to formulate how to put it to you, but you keep using the term meet the needs, meet the needs. Could you define for me what you consider the needs of young people are? Are you talking about what they want to do? Are you talking about what a teacher says they need to? I think that definition would be helpful.
the needs of learners are for me twofold. First of all, they have got to be able to be equipped with the core attributes that are necessary in our curriculum. And I said those out in my intervention earlier on to Michelle Ballantyne. But then they've also got to have the capacity to move on to a positive destination as a consequence of their education, whether that is higher or further education, whether that's the world of work, the world of training, or the world of employment. So all those opportunities have got to be available for young people, but they are going to represent different things to different young people based on their interests. And crucially, I'm very happy to confirm that I think we've got to pay very close attention to the aspirations of young people and the interests of young people. I had a group of young people in to see me last week who had taken forward a conversation about listening to the pupil voice within our education system. And these young people didn't want to have everything prescribed to them. They wanted to be influential over the curriculum that they chose. And I hear that a lot from young people within our education system. Fundamental, and where I think our debate is heading, is that we've got to have a good, open understanding of what we think all young people must have an experience of, and then that gives them the capacity to make the choices about the broader range of experiences that they have. And I will have one view about what I think should be in that core activity. I'm pretty certain Liz Smith has a different one, and it might. I fear that Liz Smith's resembles Forrester High School in 1978 or 1980, but that's a point that we can debate in later course. But it represents some of the choice that's at the heart of Curriculum for Excellence. Which brings me on to some of the points that Joanne Lamont made about subject choice. I think it's beyond dispute that there is much more choice available to young people within the education system today. There are many, many more options and courses and possibilities. I think the hard point that Joanne Lamont raises is whether that, by the nature of how we structure our education system, allows young people to exercise a reasonable choice within that expanded range, or whether in fact that is much more limited than it should be. And that's one of the core issues that I want the review to have a look at. I'm very happy to give way.
If the Cabinet Secretary would accept a slightly different point, which is in some of our schools, it's not the more limited choices in terms of numbers, but the nature of the subjects they're able to do is more constrained in some schools than others, and therefore their opportunity to go out with a certain qualification and compete is reduced, and there's actually an equality issue around that.
I certainly would not want that to be the case, and that's one of the issues that we have to address, because in all of our efforts, I come back to my core point about, in response to Liz Smith, I want every young person who goes into their local secondary school and their local primary school for that matter, and to come out having their educational opportunities fulfilled as a consequence of their education, and it shouldn't be in any way undermined by a lack of equity around the country. That point is of enormous significance to me. Ross Greer raised the issues around teacher workload, and I've put a great deal of effort into trying to reduce the teacher workload, or focus the teacher workload on what actually enhances learning and teaching. And that for me is the critical test. Does the work enhance learning and teaching? If it does not, then teachers, in my view, under the teacher agency model that I support, should be free to exercise professional responsibility over whether they exercise those functions or they do not. Ian Gray raised a significant issue which I think relates to the relationship between the curriculum and our methods of assessment. And we must, in my view, have a system of assessment that is driven by the nature of our curriculum rather than the other way around. And I think these questions will be explored within the review, along with some of the other issues that Ian Gray raised about the attitudes towards achievement and performance within the education system. The intervention I wanted to make on Mr Gray, but as I was getting up, he actually mentioned the term I was wanting to raise, which was around the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework. We're very lucky in Scotland that we have got a credit and qualifications framework that allows us to have a read across different qualifications from different sources, but they are all benchmarked against particular standards of achievement. That's a huge asset for us to have, but what I accept is that public attitudes are not nearly equating the range of qualifications that individuals are achieving at any given time. So I think there is work that we need to do on strengthening the valuing of alternative routes to the national qualifications that we take place. And actually, we should stop talking about things like alternative routes to national qualifications. It is the routes that young people are pursuing and taking forward that will deliver good outcomes for them. Because ultimately, we all want to ensure that Curriculum for Excellence delivers good outcomes for young people. And the one statistic I will raise is the fact that just a few weeks ago we saw that 95% of young people left school to go on to initial positive destinations as a consequence of their education. And that, to me, speaks volumes of how young people are being well served by Curriculum for Excellence. Now, one of the strengths of this debate this afternoon, Presiding Officer, has been the fact that all parties have put on record the strength of their support for the foundations and the aspirations and the ambitions of Curriculum for Excellence, and that is very, very welcome. I think that will help the OECD to undertake this review, knowing that the Scottish Parliament, across all parties, remains hugely supportive of the conclusions that we made at the outset in establishing Curriculum for Excellence, that it is serving young people well, and we have to challenge ourselves about how we can ensure that is done more effectively. That's what the review will undertake, and I'm sure the debate this afternoon will have helped inform the deliberations by the OECD in due course.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes our debate on the OECD review of Curriculum for Excellence. The next item is consideration of a legislative consent motion. Could I ask Hamza Youssef to move motion 21260 on the Sentencing Pre-Consolidation Amendments Bill? Moved. Thank you. Now, before we move to the next item, member staff and the public will wish to note that the Parliamentary Bureau today agreed that the priorities for parliamentary business in the coming weeks should be the response to COVID-19 and other time-bound legislation. Conveners are also being consulted on their committee business procedures, or priorities, I should say. We have therefore agreed to propose to the Parliament a number of temporary procedural changes that will allow us to do this. The SPCB, the corporate body, has also agreed today to close access to our public galleries. All our decisions are consistent with public health advice and are designed to minimise the impact of COVID-19, to help keep our staff and members of the public safe, and with a view to safely and sustainably delivering essential parliamentary business. And the Parliament will now be invited to agree a series of motions which put these decisions into effect. So the first item is consideration of Business Motion 21282 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, setting out revisions to the week's business. Could I call on Mr Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No member has indicated the wish to speak. The question therefore is that motion 21282 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item is consideration of 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Could I call on the Minister to move motions 21283, 21284, 21285 and 21286 on suspension and variation of standing orders?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. So we're going to turn now to decision time. The first question is that motion 21263 in the name of John Swinney on the OECD review of Curriculum for Excellence be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next question is that motion 21260 in the name of Hamza Youssef on Sentencing Pre-Consolidation Amendments Bill UK legislation be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And I propose to ask a single question on the 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Does any member object? No. That's good. So the question is that motions 21283 to 21286 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. That concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business, but we'll just have a short pause to allow members and ministers to change seats. A short pause.